Hello and welcome to St Cath Youth Online. My name is Rowena and I am the Children, Youth and Family Pastor at St Catherine's Church in Gorsainen. This week we are continuing our series looking at characters in the Bible, and this week we are talking about a woman whose name was Ruth. So the story of Ruth is actually told in the book of Ruth. It has the same name and it's a relatively short book in the Bible because it's only 4 chapters long. So this week, instead of me reading it to you, I thought it would be great to watch a video which explains an overview of the whole book of Ruth, what happens and specifically what happens to Ruth herself. This video is from an organisation called the Bible Project, and they are really good at putting videos together which look at books within the Bible but how they fit in with God's larger story. And if you haven't seen any videos by them before, I would definitely recommend checking them out because they are awesome and their videos are so good. So before we watch, I would like you to have a think about how well your family gets on with each other. Perhaps there is someone in your family that you get on with best, or perhaps there's someone in your family that you argue with the most. I wonder as well if there's someone that you find it easiest to be kind to in your family. So while you think about these things, let's take a watch and see what happened to Ruth.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are 3 main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
So something really interesting about the book of Ruth that was mentioned in the video is that there is hardly any mention of God within the story. However, the story is used to show us how God is faithful to us and faithful to his people in the seemingly everyday. Now, the story of Ruth and what happened to her includes some quite depressing things. There's a famine, there's 3 women who are left widowed without a husband, there's a mother who loses both of her sons, there's refugees, there's begging. In many ways, it seems like there's very little hope for Naomi and Ruth. In biblical times, a woman who was left without a husband or without a son to care for her was kind of left to face a life of destitution. In fact, Naomi wanted to change her name to Mara, which actually means bitter or sad. But God's plan wasn't to leave them in this seemingly hopeless situation. Boaz, in his kindness, rescued Ruth and Naomi from what seemed like a pretty desperate situation where they had nobody to protect or provide for them. God actually went even further in making sure that they were well looked after and provided for, because Ruth and Boaz, through their son Obed, actually went on to become ancestors of Jesus. Now, I wonder, why do you think God allows bad things to happen to people, or why God allows people to end up in these situations where things can seem really, really desperate or sad? I wonder as well why you think God blessed Boaz and Ruth by making them ancestors to Jesus himself. And I wonder if you can think of any times in your life when God has taken a bad situation but given you hope and made it way better than the situation was before it got bad. As well as being an amazing illustration of how God is faithful in the everyday and how God works his plans and his purposes out, it's also a beautiful illustration of Ruth being redeemed and how we are redeemed through Jesus. Jesus became our close relative when he came to earth as a human, and he was willing to pay the price for everyone by dying on the cross. Jesus redeems us from a life of desperation and helplessness and sadness, and all we have to do is to be willing to receive what he offers. In the same way that Ruth, by laying down at Boaz's feet and allowing him to cover her with his blanket, was telling him that she was ready to surrender her whole being to him. And this is the same for what Jesus asks for us, to surrender our whole lives and give our whole lives over to him, and he redeems us and he restores us and he protects us and he provides for us. So I hope you have found this interesting and helpful. As I say, the book of Ruth is relatively short, so I would definitely recommend going and having a read of it and seeing what you think of it, and if God speaks to you anymore through Ruth's story. So I hope you have a lovely week, and I will see you next Wednesday. Bye.